Today's lesson is how to estimate when using fractions. So let's get this written down. We are used to number lines. And if we were saying that this number line was between 0 and 1, what would that halfway point be? That halfway point would be 5/10 or 0.5. That's exactly halfway between 0 and 1. And the fraction that would be there would be 1/2. So 0.5 or 1/2 or 5/10 is exactly halfway between 0 and 1. Our halfway point tells us whether we need to let it soar or let it rest. You know the old saying, 5 or more, let it soar. 4 or less, let it rest. That's because with our base 10 number system, counting from 1 to 10, 5 is right in the middle. Even if you were trying to estimate between 20 and 30, 25 is the middle. So 5 is used as the midway point for a lot of our systems. So that's why the 0.5 on your number line, or 5/10, is exactly halfway. And we learned that with decimals, if the 10th place is more than 5, or if it's 5, we let that ones place soar up to the next digit. But if it's 4 or less in the 10th place, we would just let the ones place rest with the whole numbers. Well, this rule kind of relates to fractions and estimating if we think of the 5 as half. Because in our base 10 system, 5 is half. So we need to look at that number line and remember that the 0.5, the fraction is 1/2, which means that anything that is worth 1/2 or greater will let it soar. Half or less, let it rest. Or less than half, let it rest. So let's write that rule. You should have this rule written down. Let's write that rule. Half or more, let it soar. Less than half, what a bore. Because it would just rest with the whole number that it currently had. We wouldn't get to bump up that whole number to the next one. So we need to think of the 5 that we learned about in previous years as the halfway point. So if it's half or more, let it soar. Less than half, what a bore. Let's see how this works with some actual fractions. Draw the following number line in your how-to books. So this number line shows 0, 1, and 2 as whole numbers. We can add some tick marks at the halfway point between each. We would have 1/2, and here we would have not just 1/2, but 1 and a half. That's our halfway mark. So what we need to decide is, when we are looking at a fraction, which whole number is this fraction closest to? Okay, let's get going with some actual fractions here. Let's try 1 1/4. Where would we put that on a number line? Well, we know it's greater than 1, so we know it's going to be past here. We also know it's less than 2, so it's going to be somewhere in between 1 and 2. Now we have to decide which whole number is it closest to if we are rounding to the nearest whole number. Well, I see halves here but fourths here. So maybe I need to figure out what the halfway point would be in the language of fourths. So let's see. Halfway would be, now we have to ask ourselves, how many fourths would be half? Well, what's half of 4? 2. So, half or more, let it soar. less than half, what a bore. The 1 is going to stay the same. If we were to put this on a number line, which I would like you to, it would be right there, 1 and 1/4. And this would be the 2/4. Write that down on your number line. Let's do one more problem. Okay, 5/8. First of all, we need to figure out what two whole numbers 5/8 would be between on the number line. I don't see a whole number here, so we can assume that the whole number would kind of just be a 0. 0 and 5/8. So it's going to be between 0 and 1 somewhere. Now we have to compare it to that 1 halfway. And if it's past half, we get to bump it up to a 1. But if it's less than half, oh, what a bore. It stays a 0, that imaginary 0 right there. So we have to decide, how do we know what the halfway point would be in the language of eighths? Because right here, we've only got halves. So let's think about eighths. Halfway for eighths would be, well, what's half of 8? 4. Hey, we've got 5/8. We are past halfway. So our 4/8 would be here on the number line, so label that. 4/8 would be halfway, and we are at 5/8. So we need to draw that on our number line. 5/8. It's past the halfway mark, so that means we get to let it soar to 1. So an estimate for 5/8 would be 1. So we've now done 2 problems. We had 1 and a 1/4, which estimated is about equal to 1. So write this down. And that's because it was closer to 1 on the number line. Didn't quite make the halfway point. And we also had 5/8, which was also closest to 1. And by using a number line, we can see very clearly which whole number the fraction is closer to. Now let's try it without a number line. Okay, we're going to have 10 quick rounding problems here. I'm going to give you some fractions, and you need to tell me what it would round to if it was rounding to the nearest whole number. So I'm going to have you copy these down, and as soon as you've got them copied down, hit pause and make your best guesses using what we know already about half or more, let it soar, less than half, what a bore. And then, once you feel like you've done your best, hit play. The answers will come up and I'll talk about each one. Okay, here are your problems. Be especially careful when your denominator is odd. What would that halfway point be? So some of these are tricky. Some of these are a little bit of a challenge. And I'll mark those. So if you get stuck on them, skip them and go on, and then you can wait for my explanation. Okay, if you haven't hit pause yet, hit pause now, copy all of these down, and do your best guess for how these would round. All right, here are the answers. Let's talk about these. First of all, you can look and see how many you got correct. Okay, number 1, 9/10. It's between 0 and 1 on a number line. The halfway mark would be 5/10. And I've got 9. That's more than half, so it's closer to 1. Number 2, 3/6. 3/6 is exactly half. So that's our magical halfway point. So we'll be able to let this fraction soar on up to 1 whole. Number 3, 1/12. It would be between 0 and 1 on a number line. When we're talking about twelfths, the halfway point would be 6/12. And I only have 1. So this is really a lot closer to 0 than to 1. Number 4 is tricky. Your denominator is fifths. So first of all, let's just worry about the 4/5. That'll tell us what to do to our 3 later on, whether we leave it alone or let it soar. Okay, when we're working with 5, what would the halfway point be? 2.5 or 2.5, 2 5/10. Well, it's kind of an ugly number, but we should be able to work with it. If 2.5 or 2.5 is the halfway mark when we're talking about fifths, and I've got 4 of them, 4 is definitely more than 2.5 or 2.5 or 2 5/10. So that fraction is going to show that 3 4/5 is in fact a lot closer to 4 on the number line than to 3. We let it soar on to 4. That rhymed. Okay, number 5. This one's tricky too because you have a 3 as a denominator. So you have to think, what would the halfway point be with thirds? 1.5, 1.5 would make 3. So I only have 1, just under the mark for being half. Half or more, let it soar. Less than half, well, what a bore. And it's boring because this 1 just stayed right there. Number 6, 9 5/10. 5 is exactly half of 10, so that's the exact halfway point. That means that since it's exactly halfway, that's the magic half, and the 9 will soar up to a 10. Number 7 is tricky because our denominator is odd. 13ths. Ew. Okay, well, what would be the halfway point for 13ths? Well, 6 plus 6 is 12. 7 plus 7 is 14. And 13 is right in the middle of 12 and 14. So right in the middle of 6 and 7 would be the halfway point. So 6.5 or 6.5. Okay, so that's our halfway point, 6.5, and I'm comparing 11 to that. 11 is definitely greater than 6.5. So we let the 2 soar up to a 3. Number 8, 4 1/7. 7, another ugly odd denominator. The halfway point for sevenths would be 3.5. I only have 1. Less than half, what a bore. That 4 stays the same. What a bore. Number 9, 1.5. Well, the exact halfway point, that's enough to bump us up to a 2. And number 10, 5 10/20. Well, 10 is exactly half of 20, so that's the exact halfway point, which is just enough, that magic half, to bump the 5 up to a 6. So, give yourself a pat on the back if you got all or most of those correct. And if you had some mistakes, take some time right now to write in not just the correct answer, but why the answer is correct. If you need to rewind the video to hear my explanation one more time, then you can do that. Brian and Kareth are going camping. Finally. We registered for a ton of camping gear for our wedding. Everyone thought that was really cool and bought us a ton of it. In fact, they bought all of the camping gear that we registered for. So we had to buy our own plates and stuff like that. And we have never used it, which is just disgraceful, I know. But we are finally going camping. So, Brian's backpack, when it's packed with his provisions and food and supplies and extra clothes, it's 5 3/4 pounds. My backpack is a little bit lighter. It's 5 1/3 pounds. Now we also have some other items that we need to pack in our backpacks, but we want to make sure that we are fair in the way that we spread out all of the weight. So your job is to estimate the weights of our backpacks and materials and pack our backpacks for us in a way that they have about the same weight.